Okay, guys, because you liked The Great Brain so much, the very first, I decided to read the second book to you. Hopefully, it goes well. John D. Fitzgerald is the author. Chapter 1, The Night the Monster Walked. There were two good reasons for the people in Aidenville to celebrate Christmas in 1896, besides the birth of Jesus Christ. It was the year that Utah became the 45th state, and the year everybody in town believed my brother Tom had reformed. Papa went around with a happy look, believing he no longer had to worry about Tom making a fool out of him. Mama was all smiles, believing no angry mother or father would be calling her on the telephone to complain my brother had swindled their son out of something. Aunt Bertha looked as if Tom had suddenly sprouted wings. Uncle Mark, who was the marshal and the deputy sheriff, thought all he had to deal with in the future would be lawbreakers. It was the first Christmas parents bought presents for their sons, believing my brother wouldn't try to connive their kids out of them. There was only one doubter in our midst, and that was my oldest brother, Sven, when he came home from Christmas holidays from the Catholic Academy in Salt Lake City. Aidenville had only a population of about 2,500 people. About 2,000 were Mormons, and the rest Catholics and Protestants. We had a one-room schoolhouse where Mr. Standish taught the first through sixth grades. Any parents who wanted their children to get more education had to send them to Salt Lake City. There were plenty of places in Salt Lake City where the Mormons could send their kids for higher education, because the saints, as they preferred to be called, outnumbered other religions by 10 to 1. And there was more than one academy for Protestants in the state capital, but only one Catholic academy. Sven was 13. He was named after my Danish grandfather on my mother's side and had blonde hair like Mama. I was now 8 years old and would be 9. Tom was going on 12. I had dark curly hair and brown eyes like Papa. Tom didn't look like Mama exactly, and he didn't look like Papa. His hair wasn't blonde and it wasn't dark. He was the only one in the family who had freckles. "What has happened to the great brain?" Sven asked me 2 days after his arrival home, as we were stringing popcorn to help decorate our Christmas tree. "He hasn't tried to connive me out of a single thing since I've been home." "TD has reformed," I said. My brothers and I always called each other by our initials of our first and middle names because that's how Papa addressed us. We all had the middle initial name of Dennis, just like Papa, because it was a family tradition. Sven held the darning needle threaded with string in one hand and a piece of popcorn in the other hand. He stared at me like I was plumb loco. "Bourgeois," he said. "That little conniver could no more reform than he could wash the freckles off his face." I had never heard the word bourgeois before and assumed it was a city slang word that Sven had picked up at the academy. But I knew what it meant just from the way he said it. I told him how Tom's great brain had helped Andy Anderson so he wasn't useless anymore with his peg leg, and how Tom had refused to accept the erector set he'd been promised as payment if he helped Andy learn how to do his chores and play, peg leg and all. And I told Sven how Tom had given me back my genuine Indian beaded belt, which he had swindled me out of earlier in the year. "TD hasn't pulled a crooked stunt since," I concluded. Sven thought about what I'd told him for a moment. "Once a conniver, always a conniver," Sven said. "It doesn't sound like TD at all." "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson both thanked Papa and Mama for what Tom had done for their son," I said. "And I told them about him giving me back my belt." Sven got a sly look on his face. "And what else did TD get you to tell Papa and Mama?" "Well," I said, "he did ask me to tell them that he had his heart set on getting a bicycle for Christmas. He even got me to tell them the one he wanted at the ZCMI store." Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institute was the full name of the town's big general store owned by the Mormon Church. Some people called it the ZCMI store, and some called it the co-op. "Ha ha!" Sven exclaimed. "I knew it. TD with his cunning mind figured that a bicycle was worth more than an erector set or an old Indian beaded belt. This pretending to reform is all an act to get Papa and Mama to give him a bike for Christmas. Sure enough, Tom got his bike for Christmas. I got a new wagon. Sven got a pocket watch and a watch fob. I guess it was about the happiest Christmas of my life because it was the first time I didn't have to worry about Tom trying to swindle me out of my present. Sven still had his doubts and put them into words just before he left to return to the academy in Salt Lake City. I'll bet 10 to 1, JD, he said, that the great brain resumes his career as a confidence man now that he has his bike. My oldest brother was sure right. Tom started out a new year in his usual conniving style. It wouldn't have been so bad if there had been just one of his usual swindles, but this one got so complicated that armed men patrolled the streets of Aidenville and women and children had to remain behind sides of Main Street. Aidenville was a typical small Mormon town, but quite up to date. There were electric light poles along Main Street, and we all had telephones. There were wooden sidewalks in front of all the stores. Straight ahead, I could see the railroad tracks that separated the west side of town from the east side. Across the tracks on the east side were 2 saloons, the Sheepman's Hotel, a rooming house, and some stores. That is some Bowie knife that new kid got for Christmas, Tom said. I turned my head, and sure enough, he had that old scheming look on his face. Sven was right, I said. You only pretended to reform to get this bike for Christmas. You talk as though I were some kind of crook, Tom said, pretending I'd hurt his feelings. Just because my great brain makes me smarter than any kid in town? Sorry I called you a crook. But you did call me a crook, Tom said. And when I tell Papa and Mama that you called your own brother a crook, it will break their hearts. Please don't tell them, I pleaded. If I agree not to tell them, Tom said, I think you should be punished for daring to call me a crook. I'll do anything you want, I said quickly. Tom thought for a moment. If you do my chores for a week, I just might not tell Mama and Papa, he finally said. It's a deal, I said, and how I wished I'd learned to keep my big mouth shut. I knew if I told Mama and Papa that Tom was a crook, it would break their hearts. But I also knew that if I told them I was stupid and an easy mark, that would break their hearts too. The more I thought about it, the more grateful I was to Tom for letting me off so easy. After we'd changed clothes, I filled up all the wood boxes in our kitchen, dining room, and parlor. Then I began bringing in buckets filled with coal from our coal and wood shed. Mama and Aunt Bertha were kneading biscuit dough for supper. Mama tilted her head and had let me off easy. Tom sat on the corral fence while I fed and watered the chickens, milked the cow, the milk cow, team of horses, and Sven's Mustang, Dusty. I was exhausted when I joined Tom on the corral fence. That new kid, Parley Benson, sure likes to brag, Tom said. You mean how he bragged about his father being an animal bounty hunter for the ranchers? I asked. Yeah, Tom answered. And how brave his father is and how brave he is. I guess it does take a lot of courage to track down and kill mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, and other animals that kill livestock, I said. Sure it does, but that doesn't make Parley brave like his father, Tom said. If there's anything I can't stand, it's a kid who boasts. I knew if Tom couldn't stand it, he was going to put it here. Danny Forrester, Sammy Leeds, and Parley Benson were the next to arrive. Parley and Danny were Tom's age, and Sammy 1 year younger. Sammy had what Sven called a city slicker look. I'd never seen a city slicker, but assumed my brother meant Sammy always had a sly, know-it-all look on his face. Danny's left eyelid was half closed like it was most of the time, as if one half of him just wanted to go to sleep and the other half stay awake. Parley was wearing his coonskin cap and had his Bowie knife in a scabbard on his belt. Then Howard Kay and Jimmy Peterson, who were my age, came into the barn with rain dripping from their caps and slickers. Howard had a round face like a Halloween pumpkin. Jimmy's mother always bought him clothes a size too large so they would last him for 2 years because she had no younger sons to wear Jimmy's hand-me-downs. This was the year Jimmy's clothes were too big for him and hung on him like a scarecrow's. What are we going to play? Sammy asked. How about follow the leader? Tom suggested. Then he looked at Parley. And since Parley's been bragging all about how brave he is, let's make him the leader. I can do things none of you kids can do, Parley boasted as he removed the Bowie knife from his scabbard and laid it on a bale of hay. It didn't take me long to believe it. Parley climbed up the rope ladder to Tom's loft with us following. He went hand over hand across the rafters to the other side of the barn. We could all follow him. But on the way back, Parley swung himself and grabbed only every other rafter. Howard, Jimmy, and I had to drop out. Then Parley went hand over hand to a rafter. I stood bug-eyed as he hung by his toes from the rafter. Then he let go with his toes, and I was sure he'd dash his brains out on the barn floor. But he turned a flip-flop in midair and landed on his feet. That was the end of playing follow the leader, because not even Tom or Basil could do a stunt like that. Sammy patted Parley on the back. What a stunt, he said. I guess that makes you the bravest kid in town, all right. I wouldn't say that, Tom said. Would you say the circus acrobats are the bravest people in the world? What takes real courage is to do something nobody else has ever done. I know if Basil and I practice, we could learn to do that stunt. What takes real courage is an explorer going into a wild and strange country where no man has ever been. My pa goes places no man has ever been, Parley boasted. We're talking about you, not your father, Tom said. Now, if a boy has the courage to go someplace like the entrance chamber of Skeleton Cave at night, knowing there are monsters and big snakes in the cave, that would take real courage. Baloney, Sam said. Frank and Alan Jensen were lost in the cave before you and your Uncle Mark rescued them. If there were real monsters and big snakes in the cave, why didn't they attack you? The only thing that saved us from all the monsters and big snakes, Tom said with a serious look on his face, was that the Jensen brothers had their dog Lady with them. And Uncle Mark and I had JD's big dog Brownie with us. I saw plenty of monsters, but they never had seen a dog or heard a dog bark, and they were afraid. I'm talking about going to the caves without any dog to scare any monsters away. Parley patted his Bowie knife in his scabbard. I'll bet I wouldn't be afraid with my Bowie knife, he said. Tom picked up a straw from a bale of hay and put it in his mouth. Got to show you the picture. I wasn't thinking of betting, he said as the straw wiggled up and down. But now that you mention it, I'll bet that you're afraid to meet me in the entrance of the Skeleton Cave next Saturday night after curfew. Why not tonight? Parley said. You're new in town, Tom said. I want to be fair and give you a chance to find out all you can about the cave. It's a bet, Parley said. But we haven't bet anything yet, Tom said. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll bet my air rifle, my jackknife, and 25 cents in cash against your Bowie knife that you're afraid to meet me. Then Tom shrugged. If we both show up, the bet's off. It's a bet, Parley said quickly. I know I'll be there. The next morning, I finished my last morning of doing all Tom's chores and my own chores just in time to help Papa and Tom freeze the ice cream for our Sunday dinner. Tom's great brain worked like 60 that day. When he came down from his loft about an hour after dinner, he had a big grin on his face. Your great brain did it, I shouted as he came down the barn and into our corral, where I'd been standing guard to see that he wasn't disturbed. Tom nodded. I'm going to convince Parley Benson there are monsters in the cave, he said. That will make him afraid to meet me there. How? I asked, curious as all get out. Tom ignored my question by asking one. Have you ever seen the footprints of a monster? No, I answered. Has anyone in town ever seen the footprints of a monster? Tom asked. I don't see how, I said. Then nobody knows what the footprints of a monster look like, Tom said with a grin. I'm going to make footprints of a monster. Give me your word you won't say anything to Mama or Papa or anybody, Tom said. If we meet any kids, just tell them we're going for a ride. After we'd put the saddle and bridle on Dusty, I watched Tom pick up a gunny sack. He mounted the Mustang and rode out of the corral, waiting for me to shut the gate. Then he helped me up behind him. Tom guided the Mustang up and down alleys in a roundabout way until we were in the back of the slaughterhouse by the stockyards. The odor was terrible because there were piles of old steer hooves, hides, bones, and skulls. Tom got off Dusty with the gunny sack. He went to the pile of hooves and picked out 3 split-toed ones, which he put in the gunny sack. Sorry. He didn't say a word until we were back in the barn and had put Dusty back in his stall. Go to the tool shed and get me a saw, a hammer, and some horseshoe nails, he ordered me. When I returned, Tom held the hooves on a bale of hay and sawed off the bone on top so they would be level. He told me to get a shovel and bury the pieces of bone behind the barn. When I came back, he had a piece of board which was to have been used for kindling wood. I sawed off 2 pieces about 1 foot square. Then he got an old belt of papa's from his loft and cut off 2 pieces of leather about 6 inches long. Now, J.D., he said to me, go outside and stand guard. Don't let anybody in the barn. I was curious as anything, but I did as I was told. I stood outside the barn door where I could hear Tom hammering inside the barn. Finally, he called me back inside. Shut the door and stand with your back against it, he said. Then he held up 2 pieces of board so that I could see what he'd done. He'd nailed 3 of the halves of the steer hooves to the bottom of each board, with the toes all pointing in different directions. Then he put the boards on the ground, and I could see he'd nailed a strap across the top of each board. I stood bug-eyed as Tom stuck the toes of his shoes under the straps. Then he walked a few steps and turned around. Behold the footprints of a monster, he said. I looked at the footprints he'd made in the dirt. They looked like the tracks of a huge 3-toed animal. Tom began rubbing his hands together. When I get through, Parley and the other kids will swear there are monsters in Skeleton Cave. All right, that's the end of the first part.